Dr. Harry Bush, former Group Director of Economic Regulation at the UK Civil Aviation Authority, discusses economic regulation of the UK airport sector. Airline business models have seen major changes over the past 20 years, and I asked Harry how this has affected airport competition and business models, and what it means for economic regulation of airports.
I think it's sometimes difficult to sort of imagine yourself back 20 or 30 years and how different the world was then, with national airlines, very much state champions, big hub airports, and the whole model around those two, revolving around those two concepts. And what's changed since is liberalisation, which has enabled the growth of pan-European airlines, able to move their planes around anywhere in Europe, so fly from any 2 points in Europe. You've seen some degree of consolidation of hub airlines. You've seen, therefore, them having some buyer power, development of some buyer power over the hub airports, and you've also seen competition with European hub airports from outside Europe. Very significant. So all this has led to development of a much more competitive airport market, because airlines have choices, passengers have choices, and the airlines have the operational mobility, the operational flexibility to make use of that. So if you look at the degree of churn in routes throughout Europe, it's 15 to 20% a year. And that represents airlines choosing to go to one airport rather than another, testing their routes, responding to the prices that the airports are charging. So a very different, a much more flexible world.
And what's that mean for the economic regulation of airports now?
So I think what you're now seeing is, as I said, a development of much more competitive airport market, and that then calls into question whether you need regulation which is really designed for the constraint of monopoly. If you don't really have monopoly, what's the role of regulation? So I think that there's a case for saying that in general you should avoid regulation and move much more, as in other sectors of the economy, to relying on competition law. But even where you do have regulation, there's a case that it needs to be much more strongly justified in the past. We need regulators and competition authorities to look at the market power of airports and determine whether they've got market power, what degree of market power, and therefore how much regulation is required. And it seems to me that the general proposition would be that regulation of airports generally isn't required, but that where it is, it needs to be much more flexible, much more encouraging of commercial relationships between airports and airlines, and less cost-based than it has been in the past.
Looking at some of these changes and the range of different regulatory models around the world, how do you think economic regulation will adapt to changing market conditions?
Well, it's a question of how much it will adapt. I mean, one of the interesting things about regulation is that there are lots of vested interests once you have it. Once you have it there, you have the vested interests, obviously, of the commercial parties who can sometimes see advantage in economic regulation. So sometimes airports see advantage in the regulated asset base. Sometimes airlines see advantage in having the regulator coming in on their side in commercial discussions with the airport. And of course you have the regulators themselves who often have a vested interest in regulation and sometimes have an idea that they can perfect the perfect regulation there, the regulation that will really help the passenger. Now, where there's monopoly and the alternative is real abuse by monopolists, there's an argument for that. But where there's quite a degree of competition, then it's very difficult to see the regulator adding a huge amount of value. So I'm concerned that the process of change will be very much slower than it should be. But moving on from that, I think that there are options out there for different forms of regulation. I mean, I've been very impressed with how the Australians have managed their system over the last 10 or so years, where they definitely have airports with market power because the geographical distance means there's not a great deal of competition possible between them. But they have managed to come up with a system whereby they rely, if you like, on the threat of regulation. And the regulator stays out of it. There's a periodic review of how things have gone. Some adjustments are made to the arrangements, but in general, it's left unregulated, with the airports kept honest by the threat of regulation and airlines thereby encouraged to deal commercially with those airports. That's certainly one model. Another model is to look, to some of the emerging markets where, for instance, in Brazil, they've gone for a much more formulaic price-led approach rather than looking at costs in detail. And that was from a concession basis. But that again provides some new thinking around how you try to get regulators out of the detailed cost invigilation of airports and focus much more on the output that the customer wants, whether it's actually price or service quality.
Looking at airport privatisations now, we're seeing a more canny process where vendors are including passenger service commitments in their decision making rather than purely asset valuations. Do you think regulation is adapting to reflect this greater focus on the passenger?
Again, it's very interesting looking back to think that it's only 10 years ago that service quality regulation was systematically included in the CAA, the UK CAA's regulation. Prior to that, there had been one or two elements of service regulation, but not very much. So that was quite a big change, and it was only 10 years ago. So you've had almost 20 years of regulation pretty much without that. And I think the world is now changing so that service regulation is usually included within the basket of regulation alongside price regulation. And that's absolutely right, partly because the purpose of the regulation should be to protect the passenger. So that's number one. But secondly, because if you don't have that service regulation, first of all, the airport may be able to focus on price and cost to the detriment of service. But it also means that quite a lot of discussion that should take place around service levels and operational practices doesn't take place. I mean, one of the problems with cost-based regulation is it focuses on costs. And it gets everybody focusing on what things are costing, rather than the opportunity to improve things to the benefit of both sides, whether it's commercial revenues, operational practices. All of these things can add value to both parties. And there's got to be a much more focus in regulation on designing a system which encourages the parties to do that, rather than focusing on you get a little bit more in your budget or I get a little bit more in mine.
A key issue for many airport investors now is transparency and confidence in the regulatory process. What's your perspective and what lessons are there for governments looking at bringing private capital into airport systems?
Yeah. So the importance, I think, here is to get the regulatory systems up and running in a way that is, as you say, going to bring transparency. It's not enough simply to pass a law, set up a regulatory body. You actually have to be thinking very much about how that regulation is going to work. And regulation is about process, it's about conduct of the regulator, it's about evidence-based decision making, it's about balanced judgment, it's about all of those things. And you've got to have all of those working to really have a credible regulatory story to tell. That takes quite a lot of time to do, which is why if you look at somewhere like the UK is very popular for many investors because it's had time to develop a credible regulatory story, and people are generally reasonably impressed with the way the UK conducts its regulation. What that I think means is that countries that haven't had that path and haven't been around the block as long have actually got to develop their arrangements much more stringently in a way than even the UK has done, because they've got to build that credibility over time. Now, an independent regulator can be first part of that story, because that actually aims to take the politics out of these technical regulatory judgments, but it's not enough of itself, because it's also going to be about how that regulator, that independent regulator, behaves and how it sets up the process which gives investors the confidence that they're going to get a fair deal, alongside obviously the duty of protecting the passengers.
The use of private capital in emerging markets is normally based on securing large investments to renew existing facilities and upgrade and provide capacity for future growth. While high growth offers potentially high returns, level of airport investment also increases significantly the risk profile compared to more mature markets. How do you think economic regulatory models now can best reflect this higher risk?
Well, I think you put your finger on a very important point here, which is that these developing countries do offer high rates of growth. They do offer sometimes attractive stories, but there's a degree of variability, uncertainty around them, which means that they are high risk. And so what's the regulator to do? Well, I think there are two things. First of all, first thing to do is recognise that, and the second is mitigate it. So in terms of recognising, and I think in terms of regulatory judgments, there needs to be a real sense that allowed returns have to be higher than you would find in comparable airports, or comparable utilities indeed, if we broaden this out, in Europe and other developed countries, where there are much more stable patterns of growth and much more well-established entities. So when people are looking, regulators are looking at what are the appropriate comparators, those appropriate comparators should be other emerging markets, not necessarily looking to the really gilt-edged utilities of Western Europe. So that's the first thing. First of all, recognise and be honest about how much the allowed returns need to be. And the second, I think, is to try and ensure that regulatory uncertainty in these countries doesn't add to the burden of higher returns, because if there is uncertainty, then investors are going to demand more to compensate for that uncertainty. So there's a lot that countries in this position can do by looking at some of the points I've made earlier in this discussion around the transparency of their processes, how independent is the regulator, how far is it paying attention to evidence. All of those things will help mitigate the problems caused by this being an emerging market.